Joining us, though, to talk on issues of trust, of commerce, and also, as I said, he can take the kudo for getting it absolutely spot on how the ETS was going to play out, is one of New Zealand's most preeminent business people, former diplomat, and current chair of New Zealand Wind Farms as well, Craig Stobo, and he joins us this morning. Craig, how are you, my friend?
Hello, Mike. Hello, Michael. How are you?
Good, mate. Where were you yesterday when all this was breaking? In Auckland or somewhere else?
Yeah. So just by way of disclosure for your listeners and for yourself, I'm chairman of Precinct Properties that owns the building at number 1 Queen Street where the tragedy unfolded yesterday. So some comments from me, staff and clients in neighbouring buildings, as well as those directly affected, processing varying degrees of trauma. So I would ask that the public just gives those people time to process what has happened. Your questions, all good questions around what has happened, and we are in the hands of the police to understand exactly how these events unfolded, and we are looking forward to more disclosure as that becomes available. So where was I yesterday? I was at a conference in Wellington. My key staff were at the opening of 40 and 44 Bowen Street in Wellington, and when we got news before 8 o'clock about an evolving situation on site, my senior staff flew back to Auckland, and I was present at staff meetings this morning to assist staff understand what has happened and what that means for them. So I can't underestimate how people feel about what has happened. So there's a range of emotions that people are going through, as you'd understand.
Absolutely.
And the more we get a picture of what has happened, that the public, as much as we can understand, the better. But we're just waiting for the police to do their job. And I have to compliment them on how quickly they got to the site once the alarm was raised. So let me go through this, Craig.
Your company, it's their building. It's you're actually constructing it.
So Precinct Properties is a listed company on the New Zealand Exchange, and it owns number 1 Queen Street as part of Commercial Bay. It's a development site. It's not finished yet. It will be in the next 6 to 10 months finished. And our contractor was on site yesterday when the gunman appeared. So that's exactly right.
Yeah.
It is owned by Precinct Properties, which is owned by shareholders on the exchange.
So are you turning, I know 1 Queen Street well, it's so obviously to you know it much better than I do, but were you turning, was that a clear site that you were constructing a new building on, or a site?
It's a refurbishment.
A refurbishment.
And an extension of an existing building, that's correct.
Yeah. So that's right at the bottom of Queen Street where there's it's pedestrianised. Have I got that right?
Yeah, there's a square, Takatai Square, which, I beg your pardon, it's a square Britomart place that sits in between the train station Britomart and Commercial Bay, and it's on one corner of the site. That's right, facing the ferry terminal in the harbour.
So there's obviously no work happening on site today, Craig. Have you been getting any indication when your working teams will be allowed back on?
In the hands of the police, Michael. We're waiting for them to provide us with access to the site. So, as I said before, we're in the hands of the police at this stage.
No, that's fair enough. And on that site, you've just not got your major construction company there, but presumably, in this particular case, obviously, a number of subcontractors engaging staff as well.
Well, the head contractor is responsible for the subcontractors. That's how the kind of chain works.
Right. And it was, as I understand, also we've read it from media reports, and I guess you'd know again more than I would, Craig, it was an employee or a former employee of a subcontractor that was the perpetrator of this tragedy.
Yeah, I'd rather wait for the police to provide their full report, so it's all clear. There are a number of angles around the situation that is best left to the police to
fair enough.
Disclose.
Yeah, I understand, and I understand the sensitivity from your point of view as well. Oh gosh, that was a hell of a thing to have to wake up to tomorrow morning. Much worse though for two families that are still being notified of it.
Absolutely tragic. Absolutely tragic.
All right, now Putting that to one side, because that will ongo, and as you say, there'll be inquiries and we'll find out a whole lot of things, from why did that shooter have a pump-action shotgun to why was he out, full stop, and all those sorts of things. And obviously there are still people receiving significant health attention as I talk to you now. But putting aside all that, the thing that I was uncomfortable with yesterday was the immediate mixing of that tragedy, and for the people who were affected and some killed, with the World Cup soccer. It almost is like you couldn't separate the two. It was, oh my God, it's going to affect this. It seemed a bit infradig. What did you think?
I didn't go to the game. I was in Wellington, so I'm not completely up to speed as to what exactly was done, other than acknowledging that the event stood silent to acknowledge what has happened, which I kind of think's appropriate, given it was an Auckland event in both cases. So I don't think that's unusual. So that'd be my comment, Michael.
I guess, when 3 children were killed in Timaru, nobody went through this. But it's listen.
Well, perhaps it's not a causal, but it's coincidental that a major global event in Auckland
it is coincidental.
Started the opening night on the same day that an appalling tragedy happened. So I kind of get it.
Okay, all right.
And it's as much for the families that have been affected, acknowledging what's happened, and people wondering why. It's best to talk about it and acknowledge it and try and work your way through it, isn't it?
Well, there will be inquiries. There will be, by just about everybody. I think the police commissioner said that this morning. There'll obviously be corrections. The one, as I said though, at the start of this program, Craig, the one group that won't be actually doing an inquiry is the Justice Department. But there you go. All right, moving on. Can I just first of all give you some credit too for spotting the flaw, alerting us publicly, and being absolutely proven right on the failure of the emissions trading scheme of the government. Boy, you got that one right, didn't you?
Well, I wasn't just me, I suspect, but I was probably the first one to talk about it on your platform, so acknowledging that. But there are others who have been concerned for some time, and it's escalating, not diminishing as an issue. The carbon price continues to languish. The foresters who were looking forward to improving the price of credit as per the pathway from the Productivity Commission and the Climate Change Commission are unhappy. Those gentailers in the marketplace who were trying to hedge their businesses have now got positions that are more difficult now, challenged, and we have an uncertain time period for resolution of a whole range of issues. Bearing in mind that the one of the benefits of the scheme was to provide cash to enable distributions to the public, and it's fiscally challenging for the government for this situation, which is fiscally challenging for taxpayers. So on a number of fronts, this is untenable, and I just don't get why there's not more urgency.
Well, in part, there's an election. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, any decision that the government makes now is unlikely to impact pockets prior to the election, so you'd think they'd come up with a solution. What is the solution, Craig?
Well, it's a resolution around the intervention of the government in terms of supply of units. There are willingness to take advice from the Climate Change Commission and to allow the price to be actively traded in the marketplace. The concern expressed to me was around the potential for that carbon price to rise significantly, which was a concern around what's called a just transition to a green economy. But in my thinking, the more consumers can see the cost of that transition in what they pay at the pump or what they see in food or freight-related goods purchases, the sooner that we will adjust. At the moment, we're not adjusting because the carbon price is languishing. So the path to get to a 30% gross reduction in emissions by 2030 looks more and more difficult, while our preeminent response in a policy sense to emissions reduction is the trading scheme, and it's not working. It puts the whole strategy to 2030 in jeopardy.
Well, it's dead. I think it's dead in the water. I think they've realised that now. I think it's the realism of it. And in part, though,
Yeah,
that's...
I'm not sure about that because some parts of the political spectrum are pretty keen on the transition. When I was in Ireland, the EU countries will be fined if they don't meet those targets. We have a more malleable, I guess, agreement through Paris, but whichever way you look at it, either we're going to do it or we're not, and we're in an untenable position of not knowing where the leadership on this is.
Craig, okay, but just
be hard for business.
I accept that, but one of the reasons that you are getting what you're getting from this government is that they don't want to exacerbate what they can fear is the cost of living crisis.
Yes,
and
that's the just transition query. That's exactly right.
That's right, and so the problem that they've got, and one presumes an incoming National Act if there was policy change or a political change in 3 months' time as well, is at a time when you've got high inflation and at a time when you've got significant cost of living pressures, you're going to, with your emissions trading scheme and the consequences of, add additional costs to households of this country. Yeah?
Correct.
So,
and that all adds up. That all adds up. You're absolutely right. So we either address it now, or under our Paris Agreement, we're up for a larger sum of money to be paid for by taxpayers when we have to buy European emission trading units to compensate for our poor performance on gross emissions. This is not a costless transition, and that's the point, isn't it? It's not a costless transition. There are costs.
Okay.
And we're not facing the cost of that.
I'd like to think I'm a relatively literate person, and I like to think that I'm informed, but I haven't got a clue, as to what the costs will be for me and my family from this emissions trading scheme and getting to 2030, recognising our international commitments. Nobody has explained in any detail at all what those costs are going to be or where they will arise. Is that part of the problem?
Well, the costs are disclosed in the budget documents released this year, and I think I spoke to your audience about this 2 or 3 or 4 weeks ago.
You did.
And the costs are, and this is a range of assumptions around what we might have to pay as taxpayers in the form of purchasing those European emissions trading units.
Yeah. And
the cost from Treasury was between, don't quote me on this, between 6 and 26 billion New Zealand dollars. In GDP terms, 4 to 23% of GDP, and those numbers are, bigger in some cases than our education and social welfare budgets, to be payable in one bite at the moment in 2030. So that's the cost, and it's a variable amount or quite a wide range because there are a number of factors that go into it, including the success of our transition to 2030. And then the cost of the units themselves in Europe in 2030. So it's there. You divide that by 5 million people, and you get some interesting answers, don't you? So how do you fund that? And we don't talk about the cost of this transition. You're absolutely right, but it's there. The Treasury are trying to estimate it, but we don't get politicians talking about it. And I think business has got to talk about it.
No, listen,
communities.
Craig, you're doing it. Listen, as a result of you can I just say, at least for the platform listeners, what you're saying and what you've been saying for the last few weeks and months is spot on. I mean, these are the discussions we need to be having. It's 7 years away, 2030. Right. 6 to 26 billion is a massive difference. I mean, for God's sake, that's the difference between the deep blue sea and the wide beyond. And that we don't know is frightening. But how much we'll be paying individually or having services denied to us, whether they're hospital services or law and order services or education services as a consequence, we do need to know.
Yeah, trade-offs. You're exactly right. So what is more important to our society and what are our obligations, global obligations to Paris? If you have a policy objective and you have a regime to get there, that's all well and good. But if you don't have the regime to get there, then the policy objective becomes, well, what are we doing? and I'm not sure whether politicians are wobbling on the objective or they really don't want to have the price effect, the cost impacts, walking their way through various purchases of goods and services, and so consumers start to see the cost of transition. I mean, I don't know which one the politicians are concerned about, because they're not telling us.
No, they're not. Now, the $6 to $26 billion that Treasury estimate will be the amount of purchasing the overseas credits to deal with our emissions of carbon in New Zealand. Is that a total cost or is that an annual cost?
That's just an estimate of failing to get to 2030 with our gross emission target of a reduction of 30%. There's a different net amount, so we're assuming that some of the achievement to the target is met not by us reducing our gross emissions, because we may not get there. It's by compensating purchasing European trading units. So if we go faster and get to 30% gross emission reduction by 2030, that payment won't be made. But my thinking is that gets more and more unlikely the closer and closer we get to 2030 at our current rate of emission reduction.
There's a part of me also that goes, because I'm a politician, I wonder if we could negotiate aspects or renegotiate aspects of things that we signed up for. I was thinking particularly of the emission of agricultural issues, for example, because there is a sort of a clause that says if it's you emit in terms of food production, you can exempt yourself, and New Zealand chose not to exempt itself.
You're right. Under the Paris Agreement, there is a clause that says that all of this is not to jeopardise, quote, food security, unquote. So you're right, and that's an important card that we could play. National has already pushing the introduction of agriculture into the ETS out by a number of years, so giving time to think about different technologies to improve methane emissions. So you're right, that is an option. Whether the politicians will embrace that or not, I don't know.
Listen, if you can kick the can further down the road in politics, you do.
Yeah, okay, well, you'll be closer to responses of politicians than I am, but it does cause issues for us in terms of our global standing in this space.
Does it? Because if I was... there must be a lot of other countries, Craig, who have exempted agricultural emissions from their data counting.
But we are very different, because 50% of our GHGs, our greenhouse gases, are methane. So we're very different, closer to Ireland, but even Ireland's not as close as we are. So we're very different. The other feature that's different from New Zealand is that we are, I think I'm right in saying this, with the exception perhaps of China, we're the only country in the world that allows the private sector to offset carbon emissions with forestry. It's an unusual feature of our regime, which is obviously causing us lots of grief in our local communities around afforestation. Whereas in Europe, their concern is deforestation. They're trying to stop deforestation. So we're an unusual regime.
So it's going to require some degree of reform, radical or otherwise anyhow. Is that what you're saying to me?
Well, the scheme's been put in place. It's been embraced. There are a huge number of New Zealand businesses that are members of the scheme itself, or in the industrial equivalent stream, who are in play now, and they've signed up to the system, and we just want the government to allow the system as envisaged to work. No one's disagreeing with the concept of emissions trading scheme rather than taxing emissions. That's our preferred pathway to 2030. We've embraced it. Let's get on and finish it. Okay.
All right. And we'll have that argument and debate about how to do it on the way, which is fair enough. That's not what you wanted to talk to me today about, though. And I'm sorry for distracting you.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to raise with your readers some interesting outcomes. I don't know if we're interesting, but some really good outcomes from a survey called the Edelman, Edelman Trust Survey, which is a global survey of citizens' thoughts on who to trust in their societies, and the kind of polling looks at businesses, governments, non-government organisations, NGOs, and then the media, traditional social and search engines. And overall, this year, 2023, the results were out last week, trust has declined, although trust in business is still much higher than governments, non-government organisations, the charity sector, for example. And media still languishes down the bottom in people's perceptions. And social media is the worst within that media category. And the question that we will ask ourselves, of course, is, why? Why is trust still slowly declining? And the findings seem to think that economic optimism is at all-time lows, and that's in relation to the inflation environment we're in, which you got the CPI number yesterday, and general cost of living pressures. And so people are looking for answers and not getting them. But what does stand out, though, is that employers are still trusted. And I think that's because they're the only entity that is both competent and ethical. Trust in government and government leaders is still declining. And as I mentioned, social media is at the bottom of the stack. So this increasing amount of trust is leading to polarisation, and we're not talking about issues. We're not trying to find areas in common. We talk about areas where we disagree, but to my thinking, if we could talk more openly about issues that we agree with, we can find ways to work together, and then you get some reconciliation, resolution, and move forward. But when we have this state of distrust and we're talking in silos, we've got to find a way through this. And I think business has got a huge role to play to restore optimism and social cohesion. Growing our businesses, making them successful, paying wages, paying our fair taxes, retraining employees as they adjust to the work environment of the future, and contributing to our local communities are all important things we can do. So there is a way forward if we can be recognised of the contribution we can make with solutions and the creativity we bring. And I'm really concerned that if we don't do this, we get more polarisation, and we have all the fallout from polarisation, which is just a disaffected community. Well, none of us want that.
No, agreed. But there are, like for example, we talk about it continually on here, there are massive cultural divides that were never part of this country 50 or 40 years or even 30 years ago now, Craig, that are dividing us significantly, whether it's co-governance, or whether it's woke versus right-wing, or whether it's individual freedom, whether they're of speech or thought, versus collectivism, which seems to be a real cultural divide at the moment. Our social fabric is weakening, isn't it?
Well, that's what Kai too, the Institute at the University of Auckland around Informed Futures is saying exactly that, weakened social cohesion, which stems from trust issues. So how do you rebuild trust? You've got to talk to both sides and have the debates in the open and challenge the status quo. Why are we going down these roads? Is this going to lead to worse outcomes in the future? How do you build a multicultural nation on a bicultural treaty? How do you do that? Do you focus on Article 3? Do you focus on Article 3 or focus on Article 2? And we have to have, lots of conversations and actions in our society. We just can't stand apart and throw stones at each other. It's just not the way forward.
No, but I'm glad you raised that, because in this particular case, that debate's never occurred. The public are excluded from it. A whole series of people are making decisions that, and then having it imposed upon them that they were never part of, and never understood that was the reference point that now exists. Correct.
That's exactly right. So the transparency of the different perspectives and perceptions, and the support for those perceptions or attitudes and views is not clear. And so trust plummets, doesn't it? Because you suddenly find, well, who thought of this idea, and why wasn't I informed, and why didn't I have a chance to speak about this?
I'm glad that you've raised this issue. I've never known what the Edelman Trust Barometer is. I see that Helen Clark was involved in its governance. She's one of a number of international governors. It's sort of immaterial to me. The issue is they go, business is seen as competent and ethical, which is the point you've picked up. But then at points 5, 6 and 7, it says polarisation is most severe when divisions become entrenched, and they've used the United States as a good example of that. The social fabric weakens amid steepening divisions, and ideology becomes identity, which is something we've talked about a lot on this program as well. I'm quite pessimistic. I sometimes wonder if it's because I'm getting old, Craig, but I'm pessimistic that you can resolve these issues when people seem to be holding off into entrenched camps and then demanding that their worldview be the only one.
Yeah, so identity, politics, tribalism, if it's entrenched, just leads to awful democratic outcomes. I tend to focus on the needs, aspirations of individuals, and our society helping them as individuals in terms of education or health, rather than your age, your gender, or your racial ethnic background. And so to try and move us to a situation where we focus on the individual, I think is our challenge, because you're never going to resolve tribal or identity politics in an entrenched. Respect is what's called for, but I would prefer our society focused on the needs of individuals, regardless of their background.
Yes, that's interesting. And that Western liberal tradition of the individual is really, and their rights and responsibilities, which tend to go, one with the other, would seem most under threat at this point in time, Craig.
Yes, I think you're right, and I think, the range of commentators, including the survey that we've just discussed today, the Koitu Informed Futures findings around society cohesion, it's clear, it's happening in front of us, and I'd like to think businesses and others can be supported around saying this has to be resolved, otherwise we're all worse off.
No,
and
you're
the only
right.
way you can do that is through democracy and elections. Some would say that it's not a great system, but other systems are much worse. So we have to use the election as an opportunity to debate where do we want to go as a society, and what values do we place on individualism versus an identity-based system, and that's exactly what we have to have. I would say that's our greatest challenge as a nation in New Zealand, is this debate we're having right now.
Andrew's just said, one of our texters just said, fascinating interview, readmissions. I asked a Labor candidate what we would be paying money if we would be paying money overseas if we don't meet our emissions, and he said no. Now that's obviously that's not correct, is it?
Correct. That's not correct.
We can't believe that we'd gift between 6 billion and 26 billion overseas if we don't meet our emissions targets by 2030. And I guess are both parties, Labor, National, let's just take them as the two parties, they'll be the ones forming a government in 3 months' time, nobody else. Are they both, do you think, seeing the problem and shrinking away from it?
I don't think we've asked enough questions of all the political parties on the cost of transition at all. So we haven't had a direct response from the public around how to manage this. And are people going to walk away from commitments, or are they going to commit to it? In which case, taxpayers have to foot the bill if the emitters, the pollution emitters, don't pay through the emissions trading scheme. And that's the point. We're getting effectively a backstop with taxpayers who will have to foot the bill, all of us, versus groups that are in this emissions trading scheme environment who are already signed up for it. There's some in the industrial system that are not. It's a separate issue. But more or less, we've signed up for the transition strategy, which is the emissions trading scheme. And you can just go to the budget documents. It's in the appendices. It describes the cost of not getting to 2030.
Craig, I think this is probably one of the most important interviews I've ever had. It's lovely for you to share this. I don't want it to die away, though. I mean, the issues you raised need to be resolved. And I think you've given us a questioning line for the next 3 months of our major political party leaders as to what are you going to do in specific. I thank you for that.
Pleasure. Thank you for the interview.
Okay, good on you. That's Craig Stobo, Chair of New Zealand Wind Farms, and also, as you just worked out, he was involved, he's Chair of Precinct Properties. at which this tragedy occurred yesterday. I didn't know that, but there you go. He has many, 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 many hats, including being taumata, I see, of the Otago University Business School. Gosh, I should have asked about the rebranding of Otago University. Oh, no, I know how you'd feel about that. But this Edelman Trust Barometer, which you've probably never heard of before, and neither had I until this morning, fascinating results. We'll come back straight after this and explore them further.